Tired and out of breath, Ramond barreled through the front door of his apartment. He closed it tightly behind him and stood with his back pressed firmly against it. The act was finalized, and his apartment offered a safe haven. Nothing this world had in it could bring him down. A delirious high consumed his emotions, excitement like he had never experienced. In just 1 hour he had completed the first step. The taste of eternal power was sweet on his buds. Only 6 to go. "I'm ready for another," he called to another dimension. Seconds passed, no reply. Stopping now saddened him, but apparently it was not time. Maybe it would be better to rest. Sleep had been avoided, an interruption of the task, but it was a necessary function. Without it, he may grow too weak to pass the next test. Ramond sprawled on the bed, legs open, clothes still worn. In 3 minutes he was asleep, and the dreams came. 15 steps from the cliff's edge he stood as clouds floated lazily by. The view offered the most picturesque, breathtaking landscape Ramond had ever known, with layer upon layer of rich green grasses hugging the countryside. Far into the distance a forest could be seen, shielding any further view of the land. The cliff's bottom met the ground about 100 feet down, and on the land below, sheep could be seen, frolicking through wild daisies. The air was fresh and untainted by man. Soft flapping of his garments as the wind blew across them caught his attention. Looking at himself, he noticed flowing white robes hanging from his frame. They draped like sheets and were raw silk to the touch. Under his nose and beneath his chin, a long silver-gray beard hung, tapering down to a pointed end. A hickory cane lay in his grip as the length of it spiraled to the ground. He leaned on it gently, testing to see if it was as sturdy as it appeared. Confident it was, he turned his attention back to the wondrous valley before him. The rustling of the wind was the only sound heard for miles. Not even the baaing of sheep rose up from beneath. It was a place civilization dared not touch. As he looked around, the only word that came to mind to accurately describe this place was heaven. Ramond stood in awe, trying to soak in as much of the ambience as possible. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The natural fragrance was pleasure. With his eyes closed, his ears peaked and recognized an out-of-place sound. It was a dripping of some sort, he first thought, but as he listened closely, he was more convinced it was a hissing. His head jerked around, back and forth, quickly scanning his surroundings for anything abnormal. A visual search found nothing. Still the sound persisted. It seemed to be all around, crawling through his ears like a mole through his underground labyrinth, but its source was unknown. Had it not been for the flick of its tongue against his hand, it might have been some time before Ramond noticed it. The staff no longer spiraled to the ground, but rather hung from his hand with scales that glistened in the red sun. Firm hickory had been replaced with the limp body of a grotesquely large serpent, with its head sticking out his fist as he held the animal's neck. "Jesus!" he screamed, as he flung the reptile in a whipping motion behind him, causing it to sail through the air several yards. He spun in its direction, with no intention of turning his back to the thing. No, not Jesus, not even close. The snake spoke as it slithered toward him a few feet with sudden acceleration. Had there been a place to run, he might have tried, but all that lay behind Ramond was a steady drop. The serpent ceased its motion a body length from Ramond, and paused. Its head twisted upward as if it were checking out the progression of the clouds. Then, with ease, the reptile's body stretched upward until it rose above the ground and stood on the tip of its tail. The entire gesture was fascinating, and Ramond was sure it defied the laws of physics. The snake bent its head back down, making a 90-degree angle, peering directly at Ramond. "Is that any way to treat your father?" It spoke in a voice Ramond knew unquestionably. "Master, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Silence!" snapped the beast, cutting him off. "I am not angry. To the contrary, I am rather pleased with you. You have done exactly what I ordered, and you completed it in a quick fashion." "For this I applaud you," the creature finished, then turned its head back to the sky. A rippling motion fluttered through its length, brushing the scales outward as it passed through them. As the wave struck the head, the serpent's body went limp, and the viper came tumbling to the earth. At the collision of the head against the ground, the animal disappeared without trace. Ramond frantically scanned the acres for some evidence of its presence. Nothing was seen. "Do not be alarmed," a voice called from behind. Ramond twirled around with impressive speed. Sitting between him and the edge of the cliff was now a single green-leafed bush. It stood 1.5 feet shorter than Ramond, but its type was like none he had ever seen. It was not similar to the common yard bushes lining the apartment complex. This one was stubby, with hints of pink wrapped securely in the chlorophyll green. Its leaves were smooth like a silk plant, and the foliage was enchantingly radiant. "Surely you've heard about this one before," the voice said in a manner that was both a question and a statement. At the trail of the words, the peculiar bush made a thin popping sound, followed by flames rising from its center. The flames did not start on the outside, but rather burned their way inside out, seemingly starting from the roots themselves. The glowing blaze was immense, as it burned with 1,000,000 times the intensity that Calvary Baptist had. Power radiated off it in every direction, and anything in its path could not help but feel the energy. A cool breeze blew the flames in Ramond's direction, and he realized the blaze burned with no heat. A fire of that magnitude would surely burn with the heat of 100 suns, but this one torched away, as cool as the soft wind itself. For a brief moment, Ramond wanted, more than anything, to be standing directly in the middle of the burning, absorbing all the power for himself. The bush cackled with insane glee, but the noise that escaped it sounded more like 100 voices than just one. Mixed with every decibel of laugh was an undertone that sounded like screaming, or worse yet, suffering. The sound of the ear-bursting chuckle made Ramond cringe and stumble a step back in horror. He hoped his master did not mind his retreat. "The burning bush, I love it. It kills me every time." It spoke, letting out another short laugh that made Ramond blink his eyes hard. When he opened them, the laughter was gone, and complete seriousness bubbled in the flames. "Once again, it's time to get down to business. I am aware you wish to progress to the next test, and I am eager for you too. But before I tell you what it is, I feel I should explain. Understand, it is out of character for me to explain anything, to anyone, for any reason. Normally, I expect what I command to be done without question, but I will make a small exception in this case, only because I want you to be informed. I'm listening, Father." Ramond felt comfortable. The atmosphere was soothing. He could stay forever. "Good. I gave you the first job to see if you were serious about your proposition. I am pleased to find you are. Now you must begin to prepare yourself. Your soul is not conditioned enough to handle the rigors of being my son, but when the next 6 are behind you, it will be ready. Those who sit at my table must know all the earthly pleasures a human can experience. You have experienced many, I know, but in all your years of worship and experimenting, there is one solemn pleasure that has escaped you. What pleasure has escaped me? Tell me, and I will experience it immediately. Do not be so quick to make rash promises you may not be able to keep. The first test was extremely simple. This one will be a little harder for you. At least I assume it will be, knowing the kind of person you are. The only type of person I am is one who wants to serve you. I'll say it again. All you have to do is ask," he said, reiterating what he truly felt in his heart. "So be it. You have experienced the pleasures of a woman, even several women on occasion. Now it is time for you to enjoy a man in a physical way. Explore, have fun with it, and most of all, enjoy." Ramond choked down a hard gulp. It was a request that brought him close to sobs. For the first time he was not completely sure he could pass the test. Open-mindedness was a trait he prided himself on. He was open to women's rights and minority rights and abortion. But there was one quirk that always haunted him. Ramond was homophobic. It was not something he was proud of, and definitely not something he ever told anyone. But it was a characteristic he was keenly aware of. From early childhood he could remember not wanting to use the bathroom in public places because he feared one of the other boys looking at him. In high school, sports were avoided at the thought of taking showers with other males in the same stall. And if he were ever to be drafted, Ramond was quite sure he would flee to Canada. Cowardly or not, he just could not bunk and bathe with hundreds of other men. The simple thought of homosexuality made him queasy, and the idea of him performing gay acts made Ramond come close to vomiting. The flames flickered lower, and Ramond knew Satan had noticed his hesitation. "Ramond!" The voice exploded from the bush, releasing a wind so hard it blew the flames out. The gust caused Ramond to stumble backward and slap his hands over his ears in pain. He pressed his cupped palms on them firmly for a moment, then dropped them in front of his eyes, knowing full well what he would see. His ears were bleeding. The noise had gone far to damage them, and they began to ring with the monotony of church bells as the blood trickled down his jawbones in red sideburns. "I have spoken. This shall be done tonight, and it will be completed, won't it, Ramond?" The voice was more telling than asking. "Yes, sire," he managed through the ache. "Be gone." His eyes popped open with a force that was painful. Ramond laid still for a moment, staring up at the sheetrock ceiling, following the intricate webwork of its cracks as his mind cleared. The steady ringing in his ears persisted, and as he reached his hand up to his right ear, he found it was still bleeding, although not as bad as it had been in the dream. All that remained was the nausea brought on by the thought of what he had to do. This time he was not in as much of a hurry to perform the act, no matter how badly he wanted to pass the test. The first one was incontestably risky, But this was downright disgusting. He wondered if homosexuals felt this way at the thought of sleeping with someone of the opposite sex. It made him feel dirty, as if worms were crawling through his hair. He thought about what it would be like to kiss another man, then rolled over and spewed what little was left in his stomach on the carpet. Ramond had it bad. It was indeed the hardest thing he could ever imagine doing. And if this was only the second, what grotesque chore might the seventh require of him? It was a thought that was forcibly removed from his mind. One at a time, he told himself, and laid on his side for a long while, procrastinating the sex. He, of course, had met gay men before. In a community where being queer was hated as much as worshipping someone other than God, it would have been impossible not to meet a few along the way. They were all a part of the underworld of Sierra Springs, a different class of the same brotherhood of secrecy. It was probably the same in all towns, having the misfortune of being a notch in the Bible Belt. But Ramond had successfully managed to ignore the sexual preference of the few he knew. One thing was sure, though. Whoever he chose must be a stranger. Death was better to Ramond than having people think he was a queer. It would strip away the last shred of dignity he had. Not only would it have to be a stranger, but a stranger in a different town. No chances would be taken. The stakes were too high. Restlessly he laid in bed for hours, not bothering to clean up his regurgitated meal. He constructed yet another plan. The town, the site, the attire, everything was designed to the letter. When dusk came, Ramond was not happy. His attire had been chosen with extreme care. The idea was to look gay, but not like a straight guy trying to look gay. The last thing he wanted was to get gay bashed when he wasn't even gay to begin with. So he played it conservative, at least as conservative as possible, while still trying to look homosexual. The one semi-solid fact he knew was that heterosexual men wore earrings in their left ears, and gay men wore them in their right. It was little to go on, but it was a start. When the hole in his left ear was punched, Ramond was only 16. The fear of the needle exceeded the actual pain, but the soreness was still enough to make him whimper. But those days were gone, and Ramond had learned to tolerate pain. Removing the silver skull and crossbones earring from his left ear, he laid it on the kitchen counter. An ice cube was extracted from the freezer and placed on his right earlobe to cold numb it. In the flame of the stove burner, he held a sewing needle with his free hand. When the heat sterilized the pin to his satisfaction, he dropped the ice carelessly on the floor and tugged his earlobe, stretching it out. The needle was stuck as close to the center as possible. The pain was non-existent. He wiggled the needle around, widening the hole a bit, then pulled it completely through. With moderate prodding, the earring went in. He walked to the dresser and turned his head sideways to the mirror. The jewelry looked awkward, hanging from the wrong side of his head. It was amazing how much difference the small accessory made. The remainder of the costume was easily assembled. Clothes he had never worn were laid out. The first was a lavender silk shirt, given to him as a gift somewhere along the line by someone he could not remember. Its gaudiness was only topped by an enormous butterfly collar. However, it did feel good against his skin, Ramond found, as he slid one arm, then another into its sleeve. The top 3 buttons were left undone, leaving a spectator's view of his bony, hairless chest. Next came a pair of black pants that stretched like spandex. Not only did they look painted on, but hugged every nook and cranny of his frame. Even his crotch appeared to have sizable value, as it extruded between his legs. Loafers were slipped over his sockless feet. His hair was held back in a ponytail, and the wrist bracelet was double wrapped around his wrist. Dress-up was over. With a final glance at the mirror, he knew it was time to go. But as Ramond locked his front door behind him, he still was not happy. 53rd Street was a madhouse at 10 o'clock, making it no easy task to drive its short stretch. The town of Dalton had few options as far as nightlife was concerned, and the road housed every bar in the burg. It took 2 hours to reach the county, just far enough to guarantee Ramond would not see anyone he knew. Dalton was virtually identical to Sierra Springs, except its population had managed to climb out of the low 20,000s and up to the 40s. But no matter how large it had grown, the pew hoppers still had firm control of the activities. Pubs and drinking establishments tried to sprout up occasionally on the streets other than 53rd, but, like weeds, the Southern Baptists had them uprooted before the owners could think twice. Stating time and time again there would be no morally degrading businesses on the same streets their children had to travel every day. The townsfolk only left one street unchallenged, specifically because it rested in a part of town that was not only sleazy, but far enough away from their pristine lives to keep a leash on the children. Even then, it may have not been left standing by the heavily protesting women. But the backsliding husbands and fathers insisted on having at least one last resort in which they could go, grab a beer with their buddies, and hide from their mundane lives and wives for a few hours of bliss. 53rd Street had one stipulation placed upon it: no nudie clubs. With that rule unbroken, it flourished. Smiley Joe's blinked in Vegas style above the entrance. Just inches atop it, another neon masterpiece hung. One section blinked on and then off as the next section lit up. An outline of the eyes and face of a Cheshire cat glowed for 3 seconds, then went dark as its famous smile hung alone, brightly illuminated. It served to emphasize just how Smiley Joe's really was. The moment he laid eyes on it, he knew it was the place. A bar that had the nerve to be that corny was bound to have 1 or 2 sweet men hanging around. He parked and stepped out of the car. 3 deep breaths were taken to calm his nerves. They didn't help. The shaking of his hands would be obvious to anyone who looked close. Perhaps a drink would help, he thought, as he headed for the Smile. The minute he entered the bar, Ramond felt weighed down with the eyes that were upon him. Not just casual glances, but unhidden gawks. The color turned pink in his cheeks. Humiliation. A bar stool closest to the door was chosen, and he sat down quickly before his quivering legs gave way. Some of the customers shifted in their seats to get a better look. Ramond was a freak show attraction, just as sure as if he had been the Elephant Man. For the first time ever, he felt sincere pity for homosexuals. Is that what they have to live with? He asked himself. The only thing worse would be hiding it for a lifetime, pretending you are something you are not. To a degree, he related. He too had lived his life in seclusion, saying and doing things he did not believe just for the benefit of others. Being gay was not so bad. It just meant you were different. Nothing wrong with being different, he thought. And if these people wanted to watch, then let them. At least it meant he was drawing attention to himself, and hopefully, with the help of his father, someone special would take notice and approach him. 3 beers and 45 minutes later, no one had solicited Ramond. His audience had stared and whispered to each other for the first beer and a half. After that, the new had worn off. The beers began taking effect, and the shaking in his limbs had stopped. An urge to be done with this one came to him. The next one was bound to be easier. It was time to end this game of cat and mouse. If a cat was not going to find him, then he would assume the role of the cat and go hunting. Ready to pounce, he peered prudently across the room, inspecting anyone who looked ripe. Most of the men were with women or in groups. The few that were alone for good reason. Plainly middle-aged men attempting to pick up younger women. They were sad, the kind of chaps who would die lonely. It was hopeless. The place was a bust. There was no one who looked gay, no one who seemed even remotely interested, and no one who was worth taking a chance on. The homosexuals in Dalton had done too good a job of hiding themselves. He stood to leave. The next bar down the line might serve better. If not then the next. Ramond would search the entire town if that's what it took. The disgust of the act began to subside. He was so ready to be done with it that he almost looked forward to it. If he could just find one willing accomplice, the deed would be done. His eyes struck the man as he turned to the exit. Sitting alone in a booth under a sign that declared Budweiser the king of beers. Had the man been there before? Ramond didn't think so. As scrupulously as he had surveyed the place for prey, it was unlikely he would have missed the fellow. But he saw him now, and not only that, but the guy was staring back as well. Ramond smiled. The gentleman returned the gesture. Ramond smiled inwardly. The curiosity about where the guy came from disappeared like the sun behind a cloud. It was evident his Lord was guiding him, and it elated him to know that he was not handling the test alone. Satan actually wanted him to succeed. Courage was found in the last drop of beer in the bottle as Ramond turned it up into his dry esophagus. He checked to make sure the man was still looking. He was. As he walked toward the fellow, Ramond practiced the words he would say. They had been said to countless women before, and had worked on a few. This time, he hoped, they would work on a man. As he neared, the guy's smile increased. Ramond's intentions were obvious, and the stranger seemed receptive. It was a good sign. Even sitting down, it was apparent the guy was large. Not overweight, but tall and well-built. Had he been a woman, Ramond might have found the fellow rather handsome. But he was a man, and the guy still looked pretty much like any other. His clothing gave no hint of his sexual preference. The man wore the normal southern bar attire, blue jeans, boots, and a faded denim shirt. But it wasn't the way he dressed, but his body language, that gave Ramond all the coaxing he needed. "Hi," Ramond began timidly, just feet from the booth. "Hello," the guy returned with a lisp. His voice was high and irritating, and came across as more of an act than a true representation. Ramond ignored the mistrust. It was too late for retreat. "Can I buy you a drink?" Ramond spit the words out exactly as he exercised to himself. The man rose, swallowing vision of the sign behind him. He was much taller than Ramond had imagined. standing close to 6'6" and weighing at least 240. A monster. "My name is Keith," he said, with the lisp gone. His actual voice was deep and hazarding. Twangs of anger bounced from every syllable, and Ramond began to realize he had been duped. "What might your name be, boy?" Everyone who could see was burning Ramond with their eyes. The situation was clear. Keith had reeled him in like a large-mouthed bass, using a smile as bait, and Ramond swallowed the hook without a clue. Keith and his friends had set him up. Ramond was to be the night's joke. High entertainment for low people. "Ramond," he replied cautiously. The situation was nitro, shaky and unstable. It was imperative he handle himself carefully. "Well, Ramond, let me ask you something, boy. Are you a faggot?" The southern drawl wisped through his speech, making the word boy sound like boy. Keith's friends began circling their patsy, laughing and crooning in echo of their buddy's every word. Ramond wanted to run for the door, but knew he'd never make it. His only weapons were his words and wits. He was smart enough to know they would not be enough. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm just gonna leave, and you guys can carry on." "You ain't going nowhere, queer boy. Just settle in. You gonna be here a while," Keith informed. "That's right," someone to the left agreed, followed by several uh-huhs and yeps from the others. Ramond backed a step and turned to look over his shoulders. Every direction was blocked. The wagons were circled, and Ramond was the fire in the middle. He wanted no more of this. If he were to be beaten, then let it be. But he would not stand silently and be a buffoon. "Excuse me," he uttered, and tried to gently nudge his way past the cowboy that barricaded the shortest path to the door. "Don't you ever lay your hands on me," the cowboy cried, and placed 4 meaty right knuckles into Ramond's midsection. Ramond doubled over and turned back toward Keith. He gripped his stomach tightly, trying to hold the contents in, but the beer squirted from his mouth like the falls of Niagara, soiling Keith's boots with the slop. "Holy fucking shit," Keith blasted. "The fucking faggot puked on me." He finished, stepping backward in revolt, almost stumbling over the booth. "I'll fucking kill you," were the last words he heard as the giant brought his kneecap up to meet Ramond's face. The blow came in slow motion. Ramond watched it, frame by frame, as it moved toward him. Just before impact, he closed his eyes. Unconsciousness came immediately. "I think you'll live. Just a big nasty bump. That's all, pal." Ramond felt as if someone had stuck him in the washing machine and set it to spin cycle. His vision was still dim, but he could hear. The voice that spoke was human. Ramond knew more by feeling than sound. It was not Master. Recollections of what had happened began to seep back into his mind. Keith, the cowboy, the knee, all of it. But the voice was obscure, one he had never heard, and he wondered where he was. He could feel he was lying flat on a comfortable surface, a bed perhaps, but whose? Slowly he lifted his upper half to a sitting position. The head rush was too much, coming close to knocking him out again. He returned quickly to lying. "Just take it easy, pal. You ain't cured just yet. Rest that pretty little head of yours for a while. You're among friends." The words came from a male, but his accent was not southern. Northern, perhaps, or maybe midwestern. Light came in sections, beginning with the outskirts of his peripheral vision and crawling back to the center of his eyes. He could feel where the knee had landed on the lowest part of his forehead. An inch lower, and the plastic surgeons would have been attempting to reposition his nose. A cold rag was placed on his forehead by the stranger, and the relief it brought made Ramond feel like the man had done him the single kindest act that anyone ever had. "Thanks," Ramond managed. The ceiling light fixture came into focus, a flowery pattern with a single dove on the 10-inch a single dove on the 10-inch rounded glass. "No problem. That guy could have killed you, but nobody kills nobody in my place." Ramond held the rag in place to ensure it did not move as he turned his head to look at the man. The stranger was short, with stubby hands and small feet. His build was normal for his height, not over or underweight anywhere except for his stomach. There, a noticeable potbelly sat up, proudly looking very out of place. The wrinkles in his face made him appear to be in his late 30s, although his hair had not begun to recede yet. In his eyes there was a gentleness, relaxing and peculiar. Their color matched perfectly browned toast and hid something childlike behind them. The man said nothing for several moments, just sat on a stool next to the bed Ramond rested on, and allowed his guest to look him over. When he decided Ramond had gathered a good enough mental picture, he introduced himself. "Horace Snide, pal," he proclaimed, and stuck his stunted hand out. Ramond secured the rag with his left and reached over with his right to shake Horace's hand. "Ramond Jameson," he told bluntly, then dropped the man's hand and went back to his rest. "Pleasure to meet you. Boy, I tell you, I thought those guys were going to tear you to pieces like jackals. Good thing I was upstairs here. Bartender ran up to get me. He ain't the kind to stop trouble, you know. I appreciate it. I really do." He spoke, trying to sound as grateful as he could through the agony. "Where am I? Why, you're smack dab in the middle of my private little hideaway, upstairs from the bar. It ain't much, but it's a place away from the wife and kids and business. About the only place I got, really. But that don't answer your question none, I don't suppose, pal. I own this place, I do. Bought old Smiley Joe's here from a man named Thomas Gentry. He bought it from a guy named Frank Laurel. Hell, ain't never been nobody named Joe own this place." At this revelation, he turned his head upward and let out a fat man's laugh. Ramond fakely chuckled as a polite gesture. "No, but seriously, I've owned her for about 5 years now, I guess. Ain't a gold mine, but ain't a shit mine neither." At this, Horace gave another small chuckle, but not as robust as before. "Well, Horace, you probably saved my life. Don't think those guys liked me too much," Ramond said sarcastically, trying to keep up with the good-humored nature of the man who saved him. "Those guys was assholes. Plain and simple, pal. Ever since I moved here from Jersey, I've had to deal with the ignorant hillbillies, and I'm about at my wit's end with it. Don't worry none. I threw them out and told them to never come back. I would have called the cops, but..." Horace's smile changed. No longer did he beam the smile of a friend, but rather the smile of a seducer. He reached over and placed his hand on Ramond's arm. "But I kinda wanted to take care of you myself." The signals burned throughout the room, as sure as if he was unloading flares. Ramond's master was watching him. He could smell the aura lingering somewhere in the room. Satan had left him a trail of breadcrumbs through the forest of straight men. The way led to Horace Snyde. Ramond dropped the rag from his head and covered Horace's hand with his own, firmly squeezing it with the intention of gentle affection. The gesture would once have made him sick. Surprisingly, it was nice. He gave into it and felt a deviation inside the instant he let go. The sensation was very much like the air being removed from his lungs and bloodstream all at once and replaced with something new. He felt lighter. A burden had been removed. Ramond was mellow. Horace bent to plant a kiss. From there it started. Rise and shine. He hated being awakened. It always made him feel like his mother was getting him up for school. The light from the window illuminated the room. Horace was dressed and staring out at nothing in particular. "What time is it?" Ramond asked groggily. 7:35 in the a.m., pal." It had been ages since Ramond had slept as well, as deeply. There was strange solace in what he had done, and there was a comfort in having someone close. He wasn't as sore as he imagined he would be. Horace was not a big man. It helped. The act itself was pleasurable. If someone would have told him just hours before that he would orgasm, Ramond would have never believed it. Just the thought would have been nauseating. But he did orgasm. In fact, more than he ever had with a woman. It was not the masterful touch of Horace, though. It was the excitement that he was fulfilling the second test. The knowledge that what he was doing was driving him to the steps of immortality. It was a lovely evening. But the uncomfortable part had come. It was time to go home. Ramond knew once he walked out the door, he would never see Horace Snyde again, and he wasn't altogether sure Horace wanted him to. Ramond took his clothes from the floor and hastily flung them on. Horace said nothing, just stared out the window, lost in thought. "Well," Ramond began, not knowing how to finish the sentence. Horace snapped out of his daydream and turned toward Ramond. "Oh, you're dressed," he said, as if the world had warped ahead several minutes without his permission. "Yeah, I gotta get back. People worry about me and stuff," he lied. "Oh, sure, pal. I understand. Look, pal, you don't mind going down the back stairs here, do you? They lead to the alley. Your car's probably just right around the corner there." "No, not at all. Normally I wouldn't ask, but the bartender locks the place up for me at 3 every night, and I'd have to open the place back up to let you out. No, I understand. No need to explain. It's cool," he said, stepping toward the door. "Any time you want to come back now, the drinks are on the house." Horace invited, in a way that let Ramond know he did not mean a word of it. "Sure." Ramond turned the knob and pushed the door forward. The uneasiness of the goodbye was stifling. It felt good to be outdoors, unrestrained by walls, free. "Take care, Smiley," Ramond joked hard-heartedly as he stepped onto the wrought iron staircase. "Yeah, you too. Take care," Horace called after. In the night, his ponytail had come undone. The shirt was left untucked, and he needed a shave. He thought he must look like quite a sight walking down those stairs, a queen who had had a long, hard night. But he didn't care. 2 down, 5 to go. When he drove away from the parking lot of Smiley Joe's, Ramond was happy. The execution of Horace Snyde. This was the 6th night she had staked out the room upstairs from the bar. The other 5 had turned up nothing, and she swore this would be her last. If nothing came of it, Annette Snide promised herself she would go to confession and pray for forgiveness for not having faith in her husband. She never made that trip to church. Her suspicions had chipped away at her for 3 years now. They started the first time Horace didn't come home. He explained that sometimes he just had to stay overnight. It couldn't be helped. The place closed in the early morning, and sometimes the patrons were slobs. Clean-up could take as much as an hour and a half, not to mention counting the money and receipts and the mounds of paperwork. When all was done, there would be times when he was just too tired to drive home. He needed a few hours of shut-eye first. So he crashed in the upstairs room and came home the moment he woke. It was all part of running a business, he assured her. But Mrs. Snide did not completely trust her spouse. They had been married for 9 years, and she knew him. He could lie to you and you would never know. Horace was a master of deception, hiding behind the charm of his good nature. It was the kids that made her give him the benefit of the doubt. Surely he would not do anything to jeopardize the well-being of the family. Over the 3 years he had stayed overnight 24 times or so. Each time he finally made it home, he was tense, easily irritated, guilty. On his clothes there was an unusual scent, not strange perfume, more like strange sweat. It was happening more often lately, 3 times in the last month. Still, she never questioned him. Without proof, they would only be the babblings of an overly jealous wife. She had to catch him with his hand in the cookie jar. The first 5 nights he came out the front door around 2:45. When she saw him, she raced home to get there before he did. Horace was a slow driver. She wasn't. Kirk Snide, the oldest of the 3, was the only one who ever knew she had left the house. The 7th grader was given specific instructions. Don't answer the phone, don't open the door, and if your brother or sister wake up and ask where I've gone, tell them I had to go to Aunt Glenda's for a while. In exchange for his silence, he was allowed his passion, the pleasure of staying up late on a school night to watch David Letterman. Trust in Kirk was much greater than her trust in Horace. Kirk was a good kid and very loyal to his mother. He would die before he let a word slip from his lips. Besides, he had no idea where his mother had been going the past few nights. It was better, he supposed, that he did not know. Annette began to feel guilty herself, sitting in the car at 7:30 in the morning, spying on her man like a deranged lover. But the sight of Ramond changed all that. She had made it back just in time to see him, and was glad she decided to return. In the car, she had waited until 4 before realizing that this was one of the nights he was staying. Nothing pulled her away for hours, not coffee, not food, and certainly not sleep. Her mind was too intrigued to be tired. Around 6, she was forced to pull herself away. The kids would be up soon for school, and it would not be good for the younger ones to know she was gone. Paul, the middle kid, would be easy enough to handle. The gullible young man believed practically any tidbit of misinformation you placed on his plate. But the youngest, Samantha Kate, was a remarkably bright 6-year-old, as well as inquisitive. There would be no way to guarantee her silence. Before her alarm clock sounded at 6:30, Annette turned it off. She had made it just in time. Even Kirk had no idea of how late she had been out. The kids were dressed and fed before being carried to their bus stop, and Annette Snide went back to Smiley Joe's. With glazed, cold eyes, she watched Ramond as he trotted down the stairs and around the corner. A hornet's sting placed itself into her heart. She had not been betrayed for some lovely young mistress. That would have been unacceptable, but still grossly more acceptable than the truth. Instead, she had been double-crossed for another man. All she wanted to know was why. Why had he done this to her? Why would he risk everything they had? Why did it have to be another man? When he did stay at the bar all night, Horace normally did not get home until 11 the next morning, which gave her plenty of time. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she drove home. They were not deep sobs of sadness. Instead, they were light cries of anger, the kind that don't make your eyes look puffy and red, just furious and insane. As she entered the bedroom, she noticed the emptiness. It was no longer their room. It was now only hers. The item she came for was taken from his top drawer, and she headed back. Horace sat on the bed, still contemplating deeply. It was always like this after one of his nights. He searched for an answer. His life was perfect. The perfect wife, perfect kids. He was his own boss, yet something pushed him to risk it all. The guilt was killing him, creating ulcers in his gut where there once were none. All he wanted to know was, why? Why did he keep doing this to Annette? Why did he continue to risk everything they had? Why did he lust so for other men? A knock at the door drew his attention. He figured it was Ramond returning to get something he had left, or say something he had forgotten. He pushed the door open and peered blankly at the barrel. He knew the gun. It was his. A Ruger he had bought to protect his children. He knew the lady, too, although she had a look on her face he had never seen. There was no doubt in his mind what was going on. He had been found out. The gig was up, and for his indiscretion he would pay with his life. No words were spoken, and no attempt was made to shield his face as the bullet plowed through it. He embraced the bullet. It ended the misery his conscience gave. Annette Snide drove to the police station, amassed in her husband's blood. Outside the station steps, a group of policemen stood chattering. She walked up to them, opened her purse, pulled out the gun, and turned herself in. She was sentenced to 25 to life, with the possibility of parole in 15 years. Kurt was sent to live with a second cousin in Oakland. Paul stayed with his only living grandparent, Grandpa Irwin. Samantha was shipped from one foster home to the next, in search of someone to love her. Kirk and Paul saw each other only twice over the next 10 years. Neither ever saw their sister again.